Welcome to the Catalyst Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Epstein. Today, I'm joined by Chestnut's Dennis Watson and Justin Bell. Dennis is a senior research scientist with over 15 years of experience leading research operations and user-focused projects and strategic program development, implementation, and evaluation. Justin is a behavioral scientist with 9+ years of experience designing, executing, and publishing applied research at the intersection of well-being, organizational behavior, and substance use recovery. Guys, thanks for joining me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
Dennis, I believe this is your second appearance on the pod. So you are, I believe, the first person to be coming back for a second appearance. So congratulations.
Thank you. And I'm expecting my plaque to come in the mail anytime soon. So.
Your plaque. Yes.
Yes, it's great to be back.
Yes. No. Good to have you guys. And today we want to focus on the role of peer support specialists in substance use disorder treatment, and the challenges they are facing, just generally in today's environment specifically. For listeners who aren't familiar with the term, what is peer support? What does a peer support professional do? And why are they effective at what they do? Dennis?
So actually, I'm going to pass this one off to Justin because I feel like he's very used to discussing this topic. So, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So peer support refers to a general role that we find not only in the substance use space, which is obviously where Dennis and I are at, addiction and substance use, also across mental health, sometimes even in domestic violence programs, in housing programs, right? But the general concept is people with lived experience going through the things that the people that they help are also going through. So the classic example of this in the addiction space would be someone has recovered or is recovering from a substance use issue. And so once they've, gotten into recovery, they decide, okay, I want to go back and help other people who are struggling with substance use issues or trying to get into recovery. And so at this point now, we have formal positions. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but ways that you can become certified based on your lived experience to help other people. And so that's sort of the general concept is this comes out of, classic mutual support models like Alcoholics Anonymous, but now we have these more formal roles of people with these experiences helping other people. So I tend to use a acronym because I love acronyms. So I use the PEER model, which is, the acronym is PEER, which I think is pretty easy to remember in this context. So the P is practical. A lot of peers tend to help people with like real world needs. So that means helping people get housing, employment, navigating systems, even doing like harm reduction strategies in the case of substance use. The E is emotional, or the first E is emotional. So that's empathy, encouragement, sharing lived experience with other people. It's obviously a big part of the peer job. The second E is educational. So a lot of peers help people get education, like psychoeducation about what they're going through, help them explore pathways to treatment or recovery, or refer them to resources, or at least give them information about resources. And the last R, or the R, is relational. And so that means that a lot of peers focus on linkage. They help people build relations in the community, and sort of help them get connected with other people that could support them, either formally or informally. And so I think that sort of captures most of what peers end up doing in their various titles.
Yeah, Dennis, I think you were wise to defer to Justin on that answer. That was very, very good.
Thank you.
You were both among the authors of an article in the Journal of Substance Use and Addiction Treatment titled Advancing Peer Support Workforce Research, Insights, and Recommendations Through the Lens of Professionalization. The article addressed the misconceptions surrounding their role. What are, the 2, 3 most common misconceptions? Dennis?
Yeah,
feel free to defer to Justin, but feel
no,
free to
yeah, I
take the
think I,
initiative.
I will, but I think what I'll
Okay.
start off by saying is I don't know if we really had misconceptions in this article. I think it was really more about um, thinking about how we have um, you know, how we're looking at the role and how we've been looking at the role over the past 15 years or so versus how we need to start shifting to look at the role. And a lot of that way that we've looked at peers has been focused on through a clinical utility lens. How do we use peers to facilitate people's recovery, whether that's in purely recovery focused environments or within clinical environments. And, you know, the way that the article wants to look at it is how do we actually look at peers through a workforce lens? Recognizing that these are individuals who not only are helping people in recovery, but they're people who are in recovery themselves. And that we know that as people in our society who have jobs, that work is stressful. Work impacts our lives. We take it home with us. It affects our mental health. And how do you deal with that when you're someone who is also in recovery? And that we need to be cognizant of that when we're thinking about this role, not just looking at them as people who help other people, but people who also need support themselves as workers. And I'll let Justin jump in there.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to a wider spread, I guess, misconception, or the closest thing I would say to a big misconception about peers is not only from the research side do we misunderstand peers, but clinicians and sort of our professional establishment, the people who have the credentials or have the licenses right now and get paid the big bucks to do the treatment at the moment or are traditionally doing that sort of stuff, they don't always understand what peers are, and they don't always see them as true professionals. And so this was really what the article was trying to put out was peers are professionals themselves. Um, there was we brought this up in the article, but in the 60s and 70s was when the first drug counselors were starting to, become professionals themselves. And so they had the same problems. These oftentimes were peers themselves, but they didn't advertise themselves as much like they were peers, even though they were. Um, but they were just trying to become their own sort of profession. But a lot of psychiatrists said, "Hey, like this is our territory. We are the ones who normally we give out medication, methadone obviously being the big one then. We treat people with these sort of clinical skills that are difficult. You need to go to school, you need to, be trained. It was a gatekeeping exercise, basically. We don't think you should come into our territory. And now you're seeing that with peers as well. You have a lot of therapists, even drug counselors now themselves. It's flipped. Right now you have drug counselors saying, well, this is my territory. I went to school for however many years. I got credentialed, I got licensed. And so to watch you as a peer come in here and say, well, my lived experience is a form of expertise, well, that challenges a psychiatrist or that challenges a therapist because it sort of says, like, there's a different form of expertise in town. And there's therapists and clinicians who think that that shouldn't be taken seriously or
Mhm.
peers shouldn't be paid like as much as an expert should. And so I think that's really what the crux of our argument in the article was no, peers are professionals. They have expertise and they need to be treated just like, a therapist, drug counselor, psychiatrist would in these spaces.
You mentioned the certification process, which obviously goes to this, the professionalization of the field. What does the certification process look like? I know it varies state to state.
Yeah. And so that was the first thing I was going to say is that unfortunately, as I heard it described by another researcher, it's a little bit of the Wild West at the moment, in that every state has different credentialing processes. But I would say across states, there's generally similarities. So most of the time, you have to go through some form of education, usually classes. A lot of times, this is done at like community colleges, sometimes universities. Even sometimes peer organizations offer trainings, so you need to be trained. Once you receive training, usually you go through a credentialing test. So you have to take like an exam to receive your credentials. And then usually also a part of credentialing is to go through some sort of supervised hours. So you work in a organization that employs peers or a setting that has a peer role. Usually you're receiving clinical supervision to some degree. And so, yeah, those are sort of the three main things that most of these credentials have in order to become a certified peer.
Is there any move toward, I guess for lack of a better word, standardizing these credentials?
Yeah. Yeah. So, and this sort of brings up kind of maybe some of the downsides that could be a challenge in the future. So, yes, there are national certifications now. So, there's certain organizations that offer national certification. Not every state recognizes those national certifications. There's limited reciprocity between these certifications, but they're trying to move towards more reciprocity, so there's more of a chance that if you're a peer in Illinois, you can also be a peer in New York and, move between those states or settings, which I think would be great. But on the other hand, you see, for example, in Kentucky, they're starting to introduce peer licensure. And on the face, that sounds like a good idea, right? Like we want peers to be as credentialed and standardized as possible. Your doctor has like or lawyer or whatever has like a license to practice. And so that would be great, right? However, by introducing licensure, at least in Kentucky, they have some really weird requirements. For example, like not having a criminal record in order to obtain um, a license to become a peer, which is sort of antithetical to being a peer. A lot of peers, especially in the substance use space, they have criminal justice experience, and that's great. Like we want those sort of people who know how to navigate the criminal justice system to be able to come back and help other people through that
Sure.
process. But then you have a license that says if you have a criminal record, you can't practice as a peer. Now we're starting to enter a space where it's almost becoming too difficult to become a peer,
Mm.
and could even impact someone's recovery, and cause them to be even more stressed out and move away from getting into this role, which isn't what we want. So there's a
Yeah.
fine line that we're going to have to navigate with becoming more standardized.
Yeah,
Uh,
that
Just,
is very, very interesting.
just,
Yeah, Dennis.
Justin's bringing up a really important point, which kind of two things come to mind here. One is, this is a pathway for a lot of people who have never been engaged fully in the workforce to begin that engagement, to
Mhm.
begin to make a living wage for the first time in their life, and to hopefully have a stepping stone to more progression in career options. And the more barriers that you put in the way of that is problematic for individuals. We were talking about the differences between states. I have been working with some peers doing some research down on the border of two different states, and they have those peers. They have certification in one state, but they don't have it in the other state because on one side of the border, it's take a test after getting your training. On the other side, it's get the training, take a test, 200 hours of supervision, XYZ, and it's just a lot of work for them. It's almost, when I was looking at the requirements to become a peer, it was very similar to what I had to go through almost 20 years ago to get an addiction counseling certificate, which
Mm.
is a whole other level.
Yeah.
And so they have really, some states have a lot more in the way of having to complete. And I think that this brings up a question of sort of what is the minimum that we know that a peer should be equipped with to go into the field, and how do we get them that without placing barriers in the way? Because the more that you require of someone, that also probably comes with more time that they're not being fully compensated for the work they're doing if they have to do an
Yeah.
internship or a supervision, as well as more that they might have to pay in terms of taking tests. And that's a huge financial burden on people who are
Yeah.
coming out of addiction and working on their recovery. And my last point that I want to make, we're focusing a lot on certification. Not all peers are certified, and we should not only think of people who are certified when we use that term. Peers are anyone working in this space who has lived experience. That, but sometimes we switch hats, right? So someone can be an addictions counselor and be a peer, but they're wearing their counselor hat when they're at work, their peer hat when they're, you know, a sponsor for someone, for instance,
Mhm.
right? We also have a lot of peers who work in harm reduction spaces that may be actively using, that may not be able to, not be interested in getting a peer certification, or not be able to get a peer certification because their state requirements have specific uh, prevention against people who are actively using drugs from obtaining a peer certification. But they're still helping other people to be safe in their drug use, to access services. They're just
Mhm.
not certified.
Mhm.
Right. Has the needle moved at all last several years as far as general acceptance?
Oh yeah, I would say definitely. I think, the first peer certification ever introduced was Georgia in 1999. And when I've talked to peers who have been in the workforce for a long time, they sort of said that people didn't even begin to understand what they did. You used to get a lot more people saying in the addiction space, and this is a 12-step term, but like, oh, aren't you just like a paid sponsor? Isn't that like, why would you even go through that process? And sponsorship being the sort of volunteer 12-step position that a lot of people get when they go into those groups. And so that sort of definitely implied that they just like, this was just like a helping position. Like this was just
Mhm.
emotional support, or a friend that a treatment center would give you, which is definitely not, or it's only a small part, that emotional aspect of peer work. Since then, there's been a ton of states that have introduced certification. I think we're almost up to, I want to say 48 or 49 at this point. I think there's like one state that's still holding out or is working on introducing it. So we should hit 50 soon, which is huge in the past 25 years to go all the way up to 50 states.
Could we
Um,
name, so we can't name that state to shame them here on this podcast?
I don't want to, I want to say it's one
No
of the
state, no
Dakotas,
state
but
shaming.
I can't,
Okay.
yeah. But it's gonna happen for sure. We know that. So that's coming
And
forward and
don't get me started on why we actually need two Dakotas, but please proceed.
yeah, yeah, that's a whole nother
Whole other
conversation.
podcast. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So that's been happening. We've also been seeing Medicaid reimbursement open up, which is huge. Once again, you have, I think now at least 38 states that have introduced Medicaid reimbursement and more states that are on the way. So that opens up acceptance. And then, two, I think you just have a lot more awareness of the peer role, which partially comes from research, of course. There's a review that's coming out. There was the first systematic review of peer workforce or peer research, I should say, was done a little while ago in the substance use space. That was just recently updated and said we have even more evidence that peer research is evidence supported and has an evidence base for it. So now a lot of people in government and a lot of people in these more powerful positions are starting to pay attention because we can say there is evidence support for peers, which obviously makes it a lot more attractive to sort of the establishment. So
Yeah.
yes, I think
Yeah.
peers have done a lot of championing for themselves, and their allies have done that work as well. So yeah, it's
All right.
it's moved a
Great.
lot.
Great. In our pre-production call, Justin, you explained the distinction between peers working in treatment spaces and recovery spaces.
Yeah.
If you would, please explain these differences to our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So peers can work in both spaces, and there's even more settings beyond that. But in terms of comparing those two specifically, so treatment spaces, I mean, I'm typically talking about like a residential rehab center, the place that we think of when we think of, oh, a celebrity says, I'm going to go to rehab, I'm going to go to Passages. These are spaces that are very formalized, residential. So you have a lot of peers now working in those spaces and having those sort of specific peer roles. But typically, these are spaces that, again, because it's a formalized setting, the peers are very formalized in what they're doing. So you're a lot more likely to find peers, um, for example, delivering interventions themselves. So they might be trained in order to do like a CBT-based intervention with people, or to create treatment plans with the people that they're working with, right? So usually they have a very specific role, specific job, and they deliver it, in that specific setting. The downside of that is that a lot of times they're much more likely to be supervised by clinicians, which, as I've said, a lot of clinicians don't necessarily understand the peer role or appreciate it. And so you tend to have, I think, a lot more burnout in those settings. In recovery or community organizations, recovery community organizations, a lot of times those are peer led and peer founded. So, I know people who I work with were peers. They maybe worked in the treatment industry for a while and decided, you know what, I want to go back to my community and make an organization that makes a difference. And so it's founded by peers, it's people who understand the peer role usually. The peer role tends to be more focused on that relational aspect that I talked about, the R in the peer model, where you're focusing on linkage, you're focusing on, like, for example, like a peer, the recovery community organization might host a meeting. And so the peer's job is to get people to go to that mutual aid meeting, like a 12-step meeting or a smart recovery meeting. It may be more social. And so, a lot of these recovery community organizations, they'll have like sober rock climbing, sober biking, sober CrossFit, right? And so the peers have a bit more nebulous of a role in these organizations. Sometimes it's still very formalized and they still can do intervention and all that. But I've seen it done a lot more in this sort of like just
Yeah.
focusing on the
Mm,
recovery support, what comes
mm,
after treatment. Because
mhm.
obviously we know that treatment is just treatment. It's just the acute care to get somebody stabilized, but they have a whole lifetime of recovery.
Right.
And so these peers and the recovery support are really focused on, what are you going to do for the rest of your life? What's your social network going to look like? What are your friends going to look like? And so they can help with that aspect.
Mhm. Yeah. By the way, inebriated rock climbing sounds pretty terrifying, just so
Oh,
you know.
you got to sign a lot of forms for that for
I
sure.
would
Yeah.
I would imagine.
Yeah.
Not to be flippant. Um,
No, no, I get it.
yes. Dennis, we spoke or discussed the challenges faced by peers in harm reduction work, including the need for nuanced skills beyond just supplying resources. First, what are these nuanced skills?
Yeah, I'll start with the challenges because I think that then brings in the skills. But the challenge that a lot of peers can face, particularly if their recovery is a 12-step philosophy guided recovery that's focused on sobriety, is that they oftentimes can have difficulty grasping the full range of what harm reduction is and the concept of harm reduction. This has gotten better over the years, particularly because of the need around overdose prevention related to the opioid epidemic. And most people agree, like it's hard to disagree with naloxone distribution, fentanyl test strips, those types of things, because we know that they keep people from overdosing and from dying, right? However, it can be more difficult for peers to grasp the full range of harm reduction strategies that are available out there if they have only really been introduced to sobriety as a pathway to recovery. And so in terms of nuanced skills, what that means is a lot of peers, when they're just being introduced to this, they're introduced, like I said, to overdose prevention, which is what we consider to be structural harm reduction approaches, which is giving people things, right? It's handing out things. It's not talking with them, figuring out, having discussions, developing harm reduction based recovery plans. And by the way, for listeners who may not be familiar with harm reduction, what I mean when I say that is that individuals who are choosing to engage in high risk activities like drug use, the things that we can do to work with them to help reduce those risks for themselves, their families, and their communities. Because it's not always pragmatic or realistic that we can expect people to just stop engaging in risky activities, right? In our own lives, the parallel that's often given is every time we get behind the wheel of a car that's a high risk activity, we put on a seatbelt to mitigate that risk if we get in a wreck, right? And so these structural things are often very easy for folks to grasp. What they're not getting is what we would call the relational aspects of harm reduction. And a lot of this work in the literature has been done by my colleagues, Mary Hawk and Emma Kay, have published a lot on this. But it's really thinking about those relational aspects of engaging with people. And then how do we do that from a harm reduction perspective? And there's 6 principles they talk about, which is humanism, seeing someone as a person first rather than their substance use behavior. Pragmatism, so we're going to engage with people for practical, realistic approaches to reduce harm. Individualism, recognizing each person's experience is unique. Autonomy, persons have the right to make their own choices. Incrementalism, which just basically means that we're going to focus on small changes. We're not going to focus on that sobriety as the end goal. We're going to focus on what that person's goals are, and we're going to celebrate every small step they get there. And then the final one would be accountability without termination. So we're going to work with people to let them know that their actions have consequences, but we're never going to take away services from them because as a consequence of something like drug use. And those can be a little bit harder to put into operation for people who may be focused on sobriety as an end goal. Because sometimes doing those things within their work can feel like they're enabling individuals. But there is, when people really get down to it and learn how to apply these in practice, they can understand how this is not enabling and how to do it in a constructive way and make it part of someone's recovery plan if recovery is part of that person's goal.
Yeah. Dennis, when we spoke about this, you highlighted the potential dissonance between harm reduction and abstinence-based recovery, which can lead to emotional burden and stress. What are the chief differences in these two approaches, and how does this dissonance cause stress?
Yeah, so I think the chief differences have been sort of produced over time by individuals, but when we get to the roots of what these two things are, they're actually very compatible as philosophies. So on the harm reduction side, we often say abstinence is the ultimate harm reduction, right? If you're choosing not to use drugs, you are reducing harm in that space, but that's not always realistic for everybody. Within 12-step philosophy, a lot of people are very strict in emphasizing that sobriety is the goal. But if you get down to the original materials from Alcoholics Anonymous and some of the other offshoots of 12-step groups, mutual aid groups that have come out of that, they stress that there are multiple paths to recovery and that individuals should not dictate what another person's recovery is to them. On the other side, with harm reduction, I think that we always have to be cognizant that we shouldn't automatically, judge someone because they're involved with 12-step. We should recognize that, like I said, as a form of harm reduction for that person. But also, we should recognize too that within these two things, that just because someone is doing harm reduction does not mean that recovery is a goal of theirs. And we shouldn't be using harm reduction as a carrot to get people to recovery. That might not be an eventual goal for someone. And my final thing that I want to say on this before I see what Justin might have to add is that harm reduction itself, we've got a lot of rhetoric coming out right now that is very important and developing around how do we conceptualize a recovery pathway that involves harm reduction. What does that look like? What does that mean for individuals? Because it's going to be different for every single person. And so how do we define it?
Yeah, and I was just going to add on to that. I think the cool thing for me is that when this is done well, what Dennis is speaking about, so when you're training peers in the peer workforce to be comfortable with harm reduction, to deliver harm reduction, to learn more, just be aware of harm reduction. I think the interesting thing that you see, and I've heard this from a recovery housing organization staff member explain this to me and his experience, is that a lot of peers are going back to their abstinence-based communities. So they got into recovery through Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, and they're going back to those meetings and they're talking about their workforce experience. They're explaining to an old timer who maybe says, "Oh, I don't like harm reduction. That's enabling drug use. It's glorifying drug use." And they say, "No, look, like I got into recovery through 12 step. I love 12 step. I credit it with my recovery. However, I took this great training. I learned about harm reduction, and I see not only the compatibility that Dennis is talking about, but also how harm reduction can save someone's life. And isn't that really what we want? I've heard from people say, that have changed their minds about harm reduction in 12-step groups, like, why would I want someone dead? How am I supposed to help them? The whole message of 12-step groups is to carry the message that anyone can get into recovery, that anyone can recover. That's sort of the gist of these groups. And so if we have that message, how are we going to watch someone die from addiction? It just doesn't
Yeah.
make sense, right? And so I think that's the cool thing about having trainings like, Dennis's, is that it ends up actually having an influence on these abstinence-based groups and sort of bringing people closer together, because it's a false dichotomy. It is a spectrum across the end of the day. It's just we portray these things as going against each other when
Right.
really, as Dennis was saying, it's a continuum.
Sure.
And
Sure.
Justin,
Yeah.
Justin, can I just want to say, because he's reminding me of something that
Mm,
is really powerful. I'm thinking about like how I found harm reduction in my clinical work when I used to do clinical work in drug abuse counseling, substance use disorder counseling, is that I was taught and trained in a 12-step sort of philosophy. Abstinence is the goal, and I just had this one client that I could not get to work with me. And this was a residential situation, long-term care. So they had to look at me every single day I was at work. Their room was out right outside my office, and they avoided me like the plague. They wouldn't look me in the eye. They had tons of problems. And finally, until I learned this harm reduction, uh, tenant, you don't focus on the substance use, you focus on the consequences of the substance use, and you talk with people about those, because those are often things that people do have concerns about. And when I just did that small little shift with someone where we're talking about the things that were problematic in the community that they just couldn't deny were problematic, that shifted the whole way of us interacting, and he quit avoiding me. He'd show up in my office just to talk and chat, because I wasn't just focusing on, you need to stop drinking, you need to stop drinking, you need to stop drinking.
Right.
And I was talking about things that were important to him, that were goals for him. And that is a very, very, very powerful way of breaking down those walls for individuals. In my work in housing and harm reduction work, we often, as an example of this, we talk about, don't focus on the drinking, focus on the lease, and hold people accountable to the things that any neighbor would be accountable for who had signed a lease. So, it isn't that you're having parties where you're using drugs, it's that you're having parties that are disturbing your neighbors, and your lease
Mhm.
says you're not going to disturb your neighbors. So those
Right.
are just some examples of how we employ
Sure.
those relational aspects of harm reduction.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. Which kind of begs the question. We focus on acceptance among the professional classes providers. What about acceptance among people in recovery, people being
mm.
in treatment? What's been the acceptance there? Growing recognition that peer workers are an ally, they're helpful. I'm sure you still run into some of these barriers and these issues that
Yeah.
people recoil from any kind of help, regardless of where it comes from. But I'm curious. Um, what you're seeing there.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think there's been a lot of advancement. And I think that's in attitudes too. I think I talked with a lot of researchers who have spent their whole careers sort of in a clinical lens, just looking at treatment, in a very formal way, and not really considering, maybe they're not even considered community engaged at all. They just have purely worked with treatment organizations, multi-million dollar operations that do all these massive programs, which are great and give a lot of support. But I think they're starting to consider, um, you know, maybe we should be asking some of these people in recovery kind of what the effects are of this treatment and what the experience was like. And some of this, which I'm for, I'm not sure if everyone's for, but some of this is sort of being forced in a way, or maybe forced isn't the right word, but now you see, for example, like NIH and NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, are starting to put out requirements or suggestions, encouragements that if you submit a grant to them, you should be including the voices of the community that you're treating. And that's across the research board, but specifically in recovery, you're seeing that, if you want to have an advantage to your research grant, or even your service grant, it's probably good to include the voices of people who are in recovery, or have a community board that you bring on people from the community, or treatment advocates, recovery advocates, and include their voices in the conversation. So I think that's a really good sign. And I do think that people are having these experiences and they're coming out in a really positive with a really positive experience from it, that they have a conversation with somebody in recovery. They, sometimes consider or hear something that they would have never considered, like, oh my God, I never thought of that way, that my intervention could harm somebody that way, and that I
Mhm.
need to focus on some of those things. And so, yeah, it's a slow process. I'm sure there's a lot more people out there that still think, and occasionally I'll see op-eds and stuff every once in a while, that lived experience is overrated, and this is just, we need to consider psychiatrists as the experts overall and all this stuff. So that still opinion still exists, but overall, I think with time, people are starting to see that it's not so radical to include someone in recovery in your research process, where in the 70s and 80s, that used to be the cutting edge. That used to be only grassroots
Mhm.
organizations would do that. Now it's like, universities are doing that. And
Right.
so we're seeing a shift.
And
Right.
they've always been there too. I mean, it's just that before disclosure wasn't happening like it is encouraged
Right.
today. So, a lot of the services and things that we've developed have, I mean, 12 step, it was developed for people with alcohol use disorder, for people with alcohol use disorder, right?
Right.
So it's not strange to say that we need the voices of people um, who the services are for when we're developing those services.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for instance, in the business world, it makes perfect sense when you're talking to an entrepreneur how they founded this company or why they're bringing this to market is because they were looking for a solution in their work, in
Yeah.
their life.
Hmm.
And so they found it, so they're bringing it forward and basing a business on it. So it makes perfect sense. In reading the literature in our conversations, this term compassion fatigue crops up, and the idea that peer workers are particularly susceptible to this. What is compassion fatigue? I could intuit what it means, but
Yeah.
how do you define it?
Yeah, so compassion fatigue is a component or a symptom, typically of burnout. So usually most people are familiar with burnout, right? It's this sort of process of becoming overworked, overstressed, overburdened in one's work. A lot of it comes from the classic concept of learned helplessness, the old Martin Seligman term for, basically a person doing trying everything they can to sort of gain some sense of autonomy over their life, and like nothing is working. So that sort of tends to create burnout. So for example, like a peer who has to work, 16-hour shifts, never has any sort of emotional support, has issues with boundaries where um, the people that he's servicing are, texting him at 3 in the morning, telling them that, they have suicidal ideations or relapse ideas, cravings, and they're juggling. They have a ton of promises that they're making to people that they can't keep because the system won't allow them to. Um, one of the symptoms that will then come out of that is called compassion fatigue. And so compassion fatigue specifically refers to the fact that a lot of people in all sorts of service professions become hardened and become sort of they lose their sense of empathy in their role. Empathy is a key component. Obviously, I believe that if peer work is done well, burnout is going to happen. But if the organization puts supports in place, such as giving them time off, emotional support, having good employee assistance programs, having good supervisory support, that someone can work through that burnout and eventually come out better the other side. And I think compassion fatigue can happen as well sometimes if a peer works for years or decades in their role, they may become sort of numb to the role and they may sort of gain this sort of sense of like cynicism towards, I try to help people, but they don't help themselves. Sometimes a victim blaming sort of complex comes up. And so that needs to be addressed in an adequate way. The problem is a lot of times organizations ignore it, or they don't have any space for peers to discuss this issue. And so the peer just ends up leaving. And this has led a lot of times to brain drain in the peer workforce, where veteran peers that should be staying around, sharing their wisdom, supervising other peers, they say, you know what, the hell with it. I'm not going to do this job anymore. I'm trying to help people, and the system that I'm working in doesn't allow me to do that. My organization doesn't allow me to do that in a sustainable way. And so let me become something else. Maybe I'll become a drug counselor, psychologist, psychiatrist, but maybe I'll just go and work in marketing or something where I can get
Mm.
paid and not do service anymore. But hey, it gives me a sustainable paycheck that doesn't stress me out. And so that leads to losing really valuable peers, unfortunately, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Is
I
that what you're seeing more and more, that you are having more and more difficulty retaining peers in the
Yeah,
workforce?
I think I hear, I mean, I haven't been in this field for that long. I'm a young guy. Dennis may have some more insight on this, which I can hand it off to him after I comment on it.
I
But I would say that I do from time to time I hear these sort of horror stories of, last week we had 5 peers quit in a row. I've heard that from literally from an organization say that almost, 80% of their peer workforce walked out the door because they're just done with it. They just can't um, deal with the demands of the job and they don't feel supported at all. The promising thing is I'm also hearing more conversations about this issue. And that's what I try to do through, even my interactions on social media is to create spaces for people to talk about this. And so I am hearing more organizations becoming responsive to it, that we don't want to lose our peers. We see our peers as valuable. They're not just a box for us to check. They
Mm.
actually add value to our organization. So what can we do to sustain them? I
Mm.
think that conversation is opening up more. So I'm hopeful going forward that it'll get better.
Yeah, I was at sort of the front end of some of the first peer training that was happening in one specific state where they had gotten their first grant to start the peer certification process. We were hired as the evaluators, my team, and that led to us working on some early projects where we were employing certified peers within a research project, and we encountered these issues, and we were also learning from the certi the certification body as they were learning how to deal with these things. Like they didn't know at the time, like how do we deal with a peer who's relapsed? Like do we have to like take away their certification or pause it? And how long do we hold that for? And what do we do? And we had we had we had an issue with a peer who was just acting inappropriately on one of our projects that we had to terminate, and we had to figure out like what is the appropriate way to do this. We had a peer who unfortunately relapsed because they were probably not far enough along in their recovery to be taking on the work that they were taking on. And this goes back to the harm reduction, right? We were working in a harm reduction space on that intervention, and that individual was very much had gone through a abstinence only recovery, and they were incredibly frustrated that their clients were not moving at the pace towards sobriety that he wanted them to move, and that was
Mm.
stressing him out, and
Ah.
that's what precipitated the relapse. Thankfully that person, you know, we found out they were fine. They had gotten back into treatment. They were they had done what they needed to do to get back on track. But it opened our eyes to the potential issues that can happen, which gets back to that whole making sure that peers are trained and prepared appropriately. We have a study that gets to a lot of the heart of what we've been talking about and what Justin just alluded to with compassion fatigue. It's funded by the National Institutes on Drug Abuse. It's called PATH, or Peer Advanced Training and Harm Reduction. And what we're doing through that study is we are trying to develop a workforce intervention, a training and consultation-based intervention that supports peers to do harm reduction work. So we know that peers often struggle with doing harm reduction work. Even if they're okay with harm reduction, that they believe it's a tool that they can use, they often are not familiar with, or they're uncomfortable with some of those relational aspects of harm reduction that I had talked about earlier. And that we also have peers who work in harm reduction spaces that are often just harm reduction workers in general. They don't even have to be a peer. They face a lot in terms of stress that can lead to compassion fatigue and burnout. And so we are working with Mental Health America of Indiana as our primary community partner on this project. And we have developed a community board of 8 amazing peers from around the country who are working with us to finalize an e-learning curriculum through which we will get across hopefully some of these, covering the basics of harm reduction, but also getting into the relational aspects of harm reduction. How do we employ this? How do we actually integrate harm reduction into a recovery plan, which most peers I talk about have never even thought about that. They've never even thought about that. And then also having a module where we will discuss how do you develop a harm reduction service and recovery friendly workspace where we're making sure that we're not just holding these principles to our clients, but we're holding these principles, or our participants. Recovery community organizations often like the term participants, but we're also making sure that we have harm reduction friendly policies for our peers who work in our environment. If there's a relapse, that we're treating that appropriately within a harm reduction approach. Trying to shift the thinking. We will then follow this e-learning modules with something called an ECHO. So an ECHO is a case-based learning where we bring multiple groups together. They get a didactic presentation at the beginning of that ECHO presentation, and then we open up the space for them to think about a case that is presented to them and how they would deal with that. We're still working out the details of how we're going to run that because there's some nuances for how you can do that. And then we're going to test whether this is actually improving not only peers in terms of reducing their compassion fatigue and burnout, but is it also leading to improvement in quality of services for their participants that they work with.
I'll tell you, Justin did a terrific job of setting the stage. Dennis, you just did a great job of summing up. So, guys, thanks for the teamwork. I do appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Great talking.
Appreciate it.
No, it's a great topic, and I spoke to two of the right guys about it. So, thanks for spending the time. Today, I spoke with Chestnut's Dennis Watson and Justin Bell. We spoke about the role of peer support specialists in substance use disorder treatment and the challenges they are facing, particularly in today's environment. This is Charles Epstein for the Catalyst Podcast. Thanks for listening.